Joining me now, Eric Boehlert, senior fellow at Media Matters. Eric, how this story seemed to me to come out of nowhere and just blew up in the conservative media. I mean, it was everywhere. Drudge, Fox.
Right.
How did this guy become this kind of almost overnight celebrity?
Right. If this had been a Republican in the White House, this would have gotten 5 minutes from the right-wing media, because when the Democrats in the White House, suddenly the federal government takes on tyrannical powers and things like this. So look, they're always in search of the outrage. It's the outrage industry, and he declared a range war. The federal government made it known that they were going to come and take his cattle, and then Sean Hannity and Drudge. It's a very small group, and they all are in the same spin cycle, and everyone loved it.
I mean, but
there was no questions asked. They just loved it.
That's the thing, is that look, if you of all the people to make your cost, I mean, you just look at the fact. I mean, the guy says he doesn't acknowledge the existence of federal government.
Right.
He has not been paying for the land that his cows are using. I mean, these are the same. This is the same conservative media that's always talking about takers, about moochers, about freeloaders, about when it comes time to immigration, they say the law is the law. You can't just countenance people breaking the law. People have to be held accountable for breaking the law. The guy is manifestly breaking the law.
And he's not a part of a larger movement. He is not in terms of any sort of rights movement. He's one guy who doesn't want to pay.
Who doesn't want to pay for his cows to eat grass on federal land.
And the hypocrisy is so wide-ranging. So Obama, one of the central arguments about Obama, the right-wing media, lawless. Refuses to acknowledge the Constitution, is above the law. Occupy Wall Street. What was the _1 complaint from Sean Hannity and Limbaugh? They're breaking the law. They won't listen to the cops and things like that. So, the law and order is supposed to be a bedrock principle, but they're always trolling for this Obama angle, and so they'll upend, what's supposed to be a bedrock principle, law and order.
Well, you talk about Obama angle, but what struck me about this is this really seemed like 1990s vintage conservative activism. I mean, Hannity talks about Waco, he talked about Ruby Ridge, and let me just say this: the decision to de-escalate by the Bureau of Land Management, I tip my cap to them. I think it's the right decision.
Right.
No one should be shot or even tased over these grazing rights. Like, it's not worth it, and I'm glad to see the federal government de-escalating.
Right.
But this does remind me of that kind of Clinton-era vintage, peak militia paranoia.
Right, absolutely. The sort of the insurrectionist, anti-government, the federal government is at war with the people. And so we saw it during Clinton, we saw it during Obama. There was an 8-year gap in between for this insurrectionist rhetoric. And again, it all comes back, if you take a couple steps back, to Democrats in the White House, to Obama, and this sort of anti-government fever. And yes, they're definitely looking at Waco and Ruby Ridge.
Do you think there's a dangerous precedent in, again, like I think that the Bureau of Land Management played this correctly in backing down. Is there a dangerous precedent that basically says the law does not get enforced if you can get several hundred people bearing guns to show up and stand in the way of the federal officials who would enforce that law?
But it wasn't just those 100 people. It was the echo machine. It was the right-wing noise machine. And it was the combination of those two that has now set this precedent. And if this precedent were flipped and it was liberal activists or immigration activists, they'd be crying foul.
Are we on the other side of that hypocrisy, though? Would we be celebrating if it was someone, it was a war tax resistor, if it was someone who is sort of trying to stay in a foreclosed home? Right? I mean, don't we all just kind of want the law? We want the law to be broken symbolically when it's the law we don't like.
Yeah, but again, I think we go back to this instance. If someone was staying in a foreclosed home, they would be representing a larger movement, of the plight. This is one guy who said to the federal government, "I'm not sending you checks anymore."
And let me also say this about Cliven Bundy: the guy's doing quite well for himself. I mean, this is not a downtrodden individual. We should be clear, right? This is not someone whose family is starving, who is in dire straits because he has to pay the grazing rights. He actually runs a very successful ranch.
And he's got a very good publicist.
Eric Boehlert from Media Matters, thank you so much. Joining me now, Nevada political journalist John Ralston, host of Ralston Reports, editor of the Ralston Flash. John, this is the biggest story in the conservative media nationally, but I also get the sense it is a huge story in Nevada.
Well, it's a big story here now, Chris, because of all those people that came down from out of state. And you and Eric laid it out very well. I mean, this completely got out of hand and was twisted into something that it wasn't. Cliven Bundy is not a hero. He's not a victim here. He's a guy who essentially has gotten away with breaking the law for 20 years. And while I think you're right, the BLM had to stand down at the end, they botched this at the beginning. They set up these idiotic First Amendment zones for the protesters, and they helped make Bundy into this hero. It spun out of control. So all these militia types and the Oath Keepers come from all around, and they had a situation they could not control. I'm glad they stood down, because you go in an errant shot, a kid could have gotten killed. You don't know what would have happened. But the biggest story here to me, here in Nevada, Chris, is these Republican politicians trying to get mileage out of this, going back to the Sagebrush Rebellion, which, by the way, was settled in court here in 1979 when an attorney general by the name of Richard Bryan filed a lawsuit and lost. These politicians enabled potential violence. Their bloods would have been red if anything had happened. I'm talking about candidates for Congress. I'm talking about legislators. To a lesser extent, the governor and Senator Dean Heller, they first attacked the BLM. Then I think they realized that they maybe had gone too far, and they said, you know, calm down now. But, you know, you cannot put the cork back in this bottle once it's open.
Well, and we should note that the background context for this is that the federal government is the largest landholder in Nevada. It owns a huge swath of the state, 70, 80%, something like that in terms of square mileage, if I'm not mistaken. And also, the process here is routine. I mean, there are tons of ranchers, 99% just pay the grazing fees. This is not like this is some special case, right? This is actually a fairly routine transaction.
Yeah, one of the points that I raise, and it's actually 85 to 87% of the land, which is why it's been such an issue. But what kind of message is the BLM sending, and has it been sending since 1993 to all these ranchers who pay their fees, who obey the law, and are making some money, but they pay the fees to the federal government, when they let Cliven Bundy get away with this for 2 decades and then handle this in such an abysmal way that they have to back down at the end? And you're right, then the conservative media echo chamber. And it's funny that you and Eric talk about this being directed at Obama. This is all being directed in the conservative blogosphere at one person, Harry Reid, with all kinds of crazy conspiracy theories that he wants the land for a solar plant, even though the solar plant they're talking about is 200 miles away.
I read that. I read this. I think it was on Powerline, which is not a fringe blog, right? They made reference on Powerline. Well, there's rumors that he wants the land for a Chinese-built solar field right there, which there is totally baseless, we should say. But yes, this has become a Harry Reid as the face of tyrannical government.
Yeah, and he is being blamed for this, and he is a great boogeyman, of course, here in Nevada. But that solar plant is planned down near Laughlin, which is nowhere near that. But they've come up with all kinds of things they want it for fracking. But let's forget all that for a second. The issue here is very simple. This is not his land. It has never been his land. And now you think of what he's saying today, Chris. He's saying we want county sheriffs to disarm federal agents of the law. There are still people out there. These militia types, the Oath Keepers. There's a Republican assemblywoman by the name of Michelle Fiore who's whipping this up, referring to the government and doing what irresponsible legislators always do, choosing for the lowest common denominator, the Nazi analogy. So that's still going on even today in this state, Chris.
Nevada political journalist John Ralston with a report from Nevada. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
You bet.
All right, coming up, the situation in Ukraine is escalating as the country may be on the edge of a civil war. An eyewitness account from the ground is ahead.